And we're live. Take it away, Mariana.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself, and most of the interaction will happen there. You can also tweet us at @ShotFound, the hashtag GrassrootsEd. My name is Mariana Islam, and I'm the Director of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation. We're an education justice fund working to build a movement for equity and opportunity in public education. And for us, that also means addressing the disenfranchisement of students of color in our public education system. It means dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline and fighting back against the criminalization of students with a race, gender, and class lens in our work. Our work includes resourcing supports to several of the organizations and fearless leaders that are captured in the stories that we'll be discussing today in the new book, Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out. So several of our grantee partners are featured writers, including 2 of Schott's own board members. And I spent most of this weekend reading this book, this work of love. It's a book that I think should be required reading for every education, teaching college, university, every educator, every funder, trustee, board member, and every person working with and in service to children of color, poor children, and students themselves should actually read this book. So for me, the book is a reminder of what the work requires, from the awakening to the activation and the collective work that we need to do to turn injustice and the pain into power, and in order to make our public education system more just, high quality, safe, supportive, and culturally responsive, really from the perspective of those most impacted by injustice. And so we'll get into that. And I'm truly excited about our webinar today. I'm delighted to be joined by the authors of Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out. And I'm always delighted to be joined by my sister friend, Zakiya Sankara-Jabbar, who is the founding parent and co-founder of Racial Justice Now and the National Field Organizer for the Dignity in Schools campaign. And I'm also delighted to be joined by the legend himself, Jonathan Stith, who's a youth worker turned national director of the Alliance for Educational Justice. We will also be joined by Professor Mark Warren, who's at the Public Policy and Public Affairs Department at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And they've been on the road sharing this book at several events in cities across the country and have been gracious enough to join us for this webinar. And this is a webinar book event for everyone in our Opportunity to Learn network who couldn't make it out to those events. And so as a reminder, please post your questions to the chat box or tweet us. I'm now going to turn it over to Zakiya, who will talk us through her contribution to the book. Zakiya.
Awesome, thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Zakiya Sankara-Jabbar, as Mariana mentioned. Thank you to the Schott Foundation. Thank you, Mariana. And thank you to my co-authors and the author of the book, Mark Warren and Jonathan Stith as well. I want to take a moment and just talk about my contribution to the book. As mentioned in the book, I came to this work as a parent myself, eventually co-founded Racial Justice Now, which is based in Dayton, Ohio, which has done work locally and statewide. Organization continues to exist and continue to do really great work. I am now the National Field Organizer with Dignity in Schools campaign, where I was able to take the experiences that I was able to garner as a parent organizer and executive director in Dayton, doing local and state work, and transfer that knowledge to the national work as well, and help support the over 120 members of the Dignity in Schools campaign in 27 states, including the District of Columbia. A little bit about my story, the background of what I talk about in the book is coming to this experience with the preschool to prison pipeline when my son was 3 years old, right? Which was something that was very shocking to me at the time. I didn't even realize that was a thing until I started to do the work and do a little research and actually talk to other Black parents, Black women in particular, who was experiencing the same things, where their children, unfortunately, mostly their sons was being identified at 3 and 4 years old in preschool. So we saw that as a systemic issue, right? And wanted to, begin to look at different ways to challenge that kind of practice, to challenge the schools themselves, to challenge them around making sure that there was, implicit and explicit bias trainings, all of those different things that wasn't happening at the time. The other thing that it served to do was actually empower other parents who were at the margins, just like myself at the time. Most of the parent base that I worked with in Dayton are working class, poor and working class, again, mostly Black women who were already working jobs that had very little um, support, if you will, right? So service industry kinds of jobs, jobs that didn't have a union or any kinds of protections. So for them to have their 3 and 4-year-olds, even kindergartners, first graders, second graders, all the way up, continuously being suspended, some, right, even expelled. What we found was that parents were becoming more vulnerable to homelessness because they were losing their jobs, having to find other work and things like that. So it became a very, heartbreaking, issue to address. And for me, it fueled, my fervor and consistency and determination to make sure that parents, first of all, knew that they had a voice and that they could challenge those practices, and also call on the school districts to dedicate particular resources to make sure that they were providing wraparound support services in a community school setting. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about some of the pretty significant wins, I think, for a small Midwestern town in Ohio, and for Ohio itself, which is very conservative. One of the first things that we did when we organized the parents is that we did one-to-ones with school board members. So I think that when folks read this book, especially for parents, if they're looking to start to organize, they'll find some very practical tools to how to go about doing that. If there's an elected school board, you start to build relationships with folks on the school board. You want to definitely build relationships with the superintendent. And particularly for us, what we found is that a lot of times we were actually educating them. Although, they're the head of this, this big school district, they were not as intricately connected to what was actually happening at the school building level every day. Like, they're required by the state of Ohio annually to submit their data. And thankfully, the Ohio Department of Education actually does a pretty good job of collecting data and disaggregating data at that. So that was very helpful. I know that that's not the case in many states across the country, but for us in Ohio, that was very helpful and actually helped us leverage and win eventually a ban on preschool suspensions. The school board president at the time and the superintendent were shocked that Dayton Public Schools were one of the school districts in Ohio that was expelling and suspending preschoolers. We, again, just used the data that they reported to the state and educated them on that. We also dealt with them around zero tolerance and worked with them to eventually remove all of the zero tolerance language from the student code of conduct. And so that was something, that was very powerful. One of the things that we found out when we looked at the data, particularly for Dayton, was the student population that was being identified the most for suspensions and expulsions was at the intersection of race, class, and gender. So they were Black, male, disabled students and disability. That was the biggest catch-all, along with what's called willful defiance in places like California, and Ohio was called disruptive behavior. So that was the catch-all, that young people were being suspended for. So our first campaign, not only did we win the ban on preschool suspensions, which for the school board they thought was ridiculous. Interestingly enough, the teachers union actually pushed back on that, but thankfully we ended up getting a majority vote on the school board to stop that practice. The other piece was making sure that disruptive behavior was no longer an offense that young people could be suspended for 3 days. That was actually moved into a different category. And that was something that we saw sharply decline in suspensions the following year. So that's just, a little bit about some of the local work that we did. And finally, I definitely want to share throughout the work that we were doing in Dayton, other folks across the state in places like Cleveland and places like Toledo and Columbus and other areas, even in rural areas like Zanesville, we were able to help organize parents in other places as well. And we found out, of course, things are similar. It's just not a Dayton issue, right? We know that these suspensions, particularly with the racial disparities for Black students, which happen to be the largest minority student population in the state, were very disproportionate. And so we eventually started doing state advocacy at the State House, and we were able to push the state legislature, and Governor Kasich signed into law House Bill 318, which bans preschool through third grade suspensions across the entire state of Ohio. I believe Ohio now becomes the 13th state to have a similar kind of law. And to really wrap this up and frame that, and I think it's very powerful, is that all started with a small group of Black parents, really a small group of Black women, right, in Dayton, pushing back and saying, this is wrong. We're losing our jobs. We're losing access to our housing because we've lost our jobs. This practice has to stop. And not only, getting that done at the local level, but eventually connecting with other parents across the state and getting it done on the state level. It took us about 5 or 6 years to eventually get it done. But it just goes to show you that not only just building relationships with your local school district, but eventually educating and even building relationships with state legislators. And for us, we had to do what we had to do. Our state representative or state senator, who also happens to be the Senate Education Chairwoman, represents Dayton, happens to be a Republican. But she listened to us. She met with us every single time we wanted to meet with us. And she actually had a very practical approach to education, and she believes in education and believes that all children in the state should have an equitable access to education. So I just wanted to mention that and just say that, sometimes things can roll out a little weird and unexpected, but for us, what we found out it was mainly about building relationships and also partnering with national organizations like Dignity in Schools Campaign, like the Journey for Justice Alliance, who helped us, even SHOT helped us on several occasions when we needed support around research, around data, and all of those different things to help support our local campaigns. So that's a recipe for success, is partnerships, building relationships, and having access to amazing organizations like DSC, SHOT, and Journey for Justice.
Thank you, Zakia. I see that Mark has joined us, and he is going to be providing us with an overview of the book and what inspired the book. And certainly your story has been one of them. And so I'll turn it over to Mark.
Okay, well, thank you, Mariana. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So I apologize that I had some technical problems in joining on time for the call, so my apologies for that. I'm not quite sure what introductions have been done, but I'll just say that my name is Mark Warren. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and I am the lead author of the book, Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out, Voices from the Front Lines of the Educational Justice Movement. And I've been professor, I've been studying and working with and writing about community organizing groups, youth and parent organizing groups fighting for educational justice for over 25 years now. And for most of that time, I wrote about these efforts pretty much as local efforts, what's going on in Dayton, solely looking at Dayton or other kinds of places. And but I noticed a few years ago that things seem to be changing. And I don't know if we have the PowerPoint set up. Do we have that? Great. So if we go to the next slide, would be great. So this is one of the essays in the book. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of the story of the book, as well as a little bit of an idea of what's in it beyond what you're hearing in detail from Zakia and Jonathan. So a few years ago, some of you might know that a group of 12 Black parents went on a hunger strike on the south side of Chicago to save their high school, Dyett High School, from closing. The campaign was led by G2 Brown, who's in the upper right corner on the slide. They were responding to a massive wave of school closings that were happening in Black and brown communities. across the country, in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York City, in Philadelphia, and other places. And they had come up with an alternative plan to save this high school, which at the time was going to be the last remaining public neighborhood high school in the entire south side of Chicago, an historic African-American neighborhood. And they came up with a plan to turn the high school, not to close it, but instead to turn it into a high school of green technology and global leadership. But the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, was persistent and refused to budge and was going to close the school. So the parents had had enough, and they went on a dramatic hunger strike to save the school. And in the past, these folks on the south side of Chicago would have been supported by their local group, the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, and maybe some other folks in Chicago, but it would have been fought out pretty much as a local struggle. But this time things were different. As Zakiya mentioned, the Journey for Justice Alliance existed now as a national alliance of local organizing groups, and G2 was the director of it. So they reached out to their the Journey for Justice campaign for support around the country. They also used social media. So hashtag FightForDyett trended #1 for several days. People all over the country and even all over the world sent in their support over social media. A group of nuns in Holland went on a mock one-day hunger strike in support. Through the Journey for Justice Alliance, they were able to bring Randi Weingarten to Chicago. She's the president of the National American Federation of Teachers. And this was very significant because up until that time, the local media had had a media blackout, if you will, of the hunger strike. So when she came to town, that broke out the media for it. It ended up getting coverage in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And all of this, both deep local organizing that Kenwood Oakland Community Organization and others had done with parents and young people in that neighborhood, combined with the national reach of the Journey for Justice campaign to really ramp up pressure on the mayor. He eventually capitulated, and Dyett High School was saved and has been transformed into a school of global leadership and green technology. And G2 says this in his essay: "The hunger strike was powerful because it resonated with people all over the world who feel disenfranchised and disrespected as human beings. The sacrifice of people going on a hunger strike touched people's hearts. When people heard that folks in a low-income Black community wanted a school focused on global leadership and green technology, they were inspired. Black and brown folks understand that privatization feeds the 1% and is spreading like a plague everywhere in the world, from Chicago to Chile, and now other folks are starting to recognize this reactionary trend as well." And if you could go to the next slide, please. So the hunger strike, I think, happened in 2015. Around this time, I was noticing that a number of national alliances have been forming over the last 5 or 6 years, including the Dignity in Schools campaign that Zakiya referred to, the Alliance for Educational Justice, which Jonathan will be talking about, as well as the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. Something different was happening. The organizing efforts by parents and young people and educators were no longer limited to local communities, but as G2 says, these local struggles are being nationalized. There was, in a sense, a reemergence of a national educational justice movement. And so I'm a professor. I write articles and books. So I wrote an article talking about not just the need to approach education reform from the point of view of educational justice, but how an educational justice movement was emerging, and tried to document and describe some of that. And now I'm not the first person, certainly, to talk about educational justice or educational justice movements. There's always been educational justice movements rooted in communities of color in our country historically. But something new was happening, and the article I wrote about it was available free online. It was downloaded thousands of times within a month, and it really struck a chord to try to articulate something that people were seeing and feeling the need for out there. And so people asked me, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I write books. I could write a book about this. But I was challenged by some of the organizers to say, you know, why should you write a book? Why don't you do something different this time? Why don't you help us lift up our own stories, write our own history, share our strategies and our successes and our reflections upon the years of careful organizing work that we are doing. And that's how the book Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out emerged. And if you could show the next slide, please. So we we got together a couple times so that the contributors and the organizers could share what they were thinking about writing with each other. And at the end of the second meeting, we were ready to go home. And I said, well, I guess we're done. Now we'll have the book come out. And people said, no, no, no. This has been a great opportunity for us to come together as a network, as a community where we can have a chance to reflect. We're not, most of our time we're spent organizing, rushing around. We don't always have a chance to stop and share with each other and lift up some of these lessons. We want to continue to stay together. Why can't we form a people's think tank? The corporate elites on the left and the right, they have their think tanks. Why can't community organizers and education activists have our think tank? Why can't the book be the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of an effort to reflect and to do some deep analysis and lift up our stories? And so we decided to stay together. And with the support that we now have from the Ford Foundation and the Schott Foundation, we are forming a people's think tank. And this talking about the book is also an opportunity to invite you to join us in this conversation moving forward. So if you do the next slide too, please. So this book is meant to support movement building and organizing. So you can tweet comments out if you want, and we're collecting your thoughts for material for the think tank. You can sign up to get updates and learn what's going to happen with the People's Think Tank. There's an address there, and we have a website for the book where you can sign up, and also if you care to buy the book, it's there. And of course, what we really want you to do is connect with and support parents and young people and educators and other movement allies in support of building an education justice movement. So if you could show them the next slide, please. So just briefly, I want to give you a sense of the sweep of the book, what's kind of in the book, and also what's on our minds in terms of what we think needs to be done to build a stronger and more intersectional education justice movement. So the first point was that if it's really going to be a strong and effective movement, it has to be centered on and have the participation and leadership of people who are most affected by educational injustice. And by that, we mean students and their parents and families in low-income communities of color. So the first set of essays, in fact, the very first essay in the book is by Zakiya, talking about some of the things that she shared today, because we felt it was important for the entire effort to start with the story and analysis and experience and leadership of Black parents, parents of color, and also students in organizing. So that's the first part of the book. So we believe that's foundational, but a successful movement, as I think Zakiya also mentioned at the end of her remarks, needs broader alliances. The reason that Racial Justice Now was able to be so effective in Dayton, in a conservative area, was in part their very deep and good organizing there with Black parents, but also because they could draw on the resources of the Dignity in Schools campaign and the Journey for Justice campaign. So the second set of essays is about people who are thinking carefully about how to build these alliances in a way that don't just focus on Washington, but really support and strengthen and spread local organizing and state level organizing. And Jonathan's essays, as we'll be talking about, is both the importance of youth at the center of the movement, but also the Alliance for Educational Justice as a national alliance that supports and strengthens youth organizing across the country. So that's the second part of the book. But third, we say, okay, all that's true, but education is something different. It's special. It's not like building housing or something that we might organize around. It's really a human endeavor, and that to really transform public education so that it is really empowering and connecting with parents and empowering young people, we really need to change the hearts and minds of educators who are inside of our schools. And so the third part of the book is really the stories and strategies and reflections of teacher activists, educators at all kinds of levels in our public education system, who are really organizing other educators to make change, to find ways to ally with parents and young people in low-income communities of color and make change on the inside. Policy change is incredibly important. Changing school discipline policy at the district level is critical, but it may not matter at all unless people who are carrying out those policies on the inside of school, if they are also engaged in this process with their hearts and their minds and willing contributors to it. And then the last part of the book says that's all true, But in the end, we are probably still not going to transform public education solely within the four walls of the school. The failings of our public school system are really part of a larger systemic racial inequities and poverty in our larger society issues. If children are growing up in poverty, homeless, if their parents are working all kinds of jobs and still living in poverty, if they're experiencing police violence or intercommunal violence in their neighborhoods, all these are issues that are going to impact what is happening in our education system. So we have to find ways to bring the labor movement together, the LGBTQ movement together, immigrant rights movements together, and other movements together around an intersectional approach to build a stronger social justice movement. And the last set of essays in the book are with people who are doing just that. Jeffrey Winder from the Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network, for example, and other kinds of people are writing about how they're doing this work today to try to lift up models and inspire other people. So let me just end by saying that, we do believe that educational justice in many ways can spark a larger social justice movement. Education is not just one issue. It's really at the center of American democracy, its promises and its failings. It's key to the liberation of people, going back to the struggle of African-American slaves for the ability to read. And it's about the future of our next generation. And we end the book in a challenge that I think is the challenge for us and for everyone. Is our next generation, are they going to be cogs in a capitalist system working low-wage jobs for the rest of their lives? Are they going to be fodder for a prison and mass incarceration system? Or are they going to be empowered and lifted up to be social change agents in their lives and social justice organizers for their communities? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And with that, we talk about centering those most impacted are the students, right? And so we want to get into the student organizing work and the work that you've done, Jonathan, and your contributions to this book.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for having me. Again, my name is Jonathan Stith. I'm the National Coordinator for the Alliance for Educational Justice. And AJ is a national network of youth organizing groups that we came together in 2010, right at the start of the Obama administration. Before then, as my story talks about, I was a youth worker in DC. And one of the things that we would always notice, or when we would talk with other youth workers, was just how the quality of young people's day at school impacted what we were able to do or not do after school. And oftentimes found ourselves having to advocate for young people just almost in the sake of for the sake of youth development, right? Because if they weren't coming to school, then they probably weren't going to come to our after school program. And if they showed up at our after school program during school, then there was a problem that we had to try to figure out. And so for me, there was a moment of kind of, I guess, radicalization that we talk about. I was doing service learning at H.D. Woodson High School, and there was this area that we were trying to clean up. And the young folk just refused to do it. And I would try, I was doing my best facilitation. It was not working. And then finally just had a moment, asked them kind of what was happening. And then they pointed out that they weren't going to clean it up because it would just be dirty next week because somebody was dumping there, right? And so for me, that was a real moment where I was like, I've reached the real limits of community service. Like, the young folk are right. Like, if someone is dumping here, this is a problem bigger than service. And so we got in contact with a group that was doing youth organizing environmental justice. And they came, they taught us how to do an action. We staked it out, took pictures, and then confronted a city council member, got the company cited, and got the dumping to stop. And for me, it was just a huge moment of transformation. Again, saw the club and young people's engagement and leadership just grow by leaps and bounds, and was clear. One of the things I remember was that, like, they would be like, community service is something you do when you get in trouble with the law. Youth organizing is something you do to change your community. And so that was kind of how I was thrust into youth organizing. Went on to lead a group in DC called the Youth Education Alliance. At our height in 2006, young people here led a campaign to win the School Modernization Act that won $3.2 billion for school reform in the district. And so as we were pivoting to try to figure out what our next piece was, we started to investigate the grounds, because it was clear to us that we couldn't just win new school buildings and not win new things happening in those schools. And so we started to look, and I think this was also about the time when we started to learn about the school to prison pipeline. And I can remember a time when people argued the existence of it. Even some allies, folk who researchers, right? Many of the people who make lots of money now writing about or documenting the phenomenon were like, it does not exist, right? And so for us, the kind of coming together around 2010 was we saw an opportunity with the switch with the Obama administration. Groups have been organizing now on the ground for about 20 years. Most of the groups that make up the alliance are youth-led or intergenerational groups, covering about 14 cities. Most of them engage high school students around a wide range of issues, but most folk were doing some form of college access, realized that the school to prison pipeline was barring access to college. They couldn't get to college because they were getting pushed out. And I kind of tried to pivot our work, a lot of groups' work. And one of the things that we would hear when we would try to make changes or win changes is that states and local governments would tell us that it was no child left behind. It was federal law. It was federal policy of zero tolerance that made discriminatory discipline the law. And so for us, the Alliance comes together at that moment to say, actually, we're going to try to push federal policy, try to change the political conditions on a national level with hopes that it shift and created more opportunities for groups to win on the ground. And so a lot of our work, again, around that was engaging with, again, a lot of the networks, DSC, even Journey for Justice, really around kind of trying to shape the administration's kind of direction. I think one of the things happened was one, the kind of acknowledgement that there is this school to prison pipeline. But for us, that came, unfortunately, at the death of Trayvon Martin. And that was another, again, pivotal moment for youth organizing groups and young people in this country who were then politicized and really understanding extrajudicial killings, state violence, and police violence as they are witnessing and also on some levels participating in the emerging Black Lives Matter movement. And so for us, between Trayvon and the emergence of that, we experienced a death of a young person in our alliance, George Carter III, from New Orleans, who was killed in an act of intercommunal youth violence on his way to school. And for us, that was, again, a really heart grab. When we sat with it, we understand the conditions. He talked about it the last time we were together, when the verdict had dropped, right? And I remember, again, all the young people saying that they were afraid of going home to being, confronted by police or some racist white guy. And George was like, I'm afraid of the folk in my community, right? The conditions here have been created so dangerous that folk are fighting for their survival and hurting each other along the way. And then he was killed less than a year later, right? But what got us was that then the New Orleans police tried to criminalize him in his death, tried to say that insinuate he was part of a corner store robbery, right? And I'm a youth worker, and I don't put any, I understand the kind of range of behaviors young people can engage in for a variety of reasons. Anybody knew George was like, that's just not true. And so for us, it was, again, this kind of real affront around kind of state violence, like whether you're Trayvon or whether you're George, you're criminalized in your death, right? And then there was a direct connection, or us beginning to understand kind of the set of circumstances around Trayvon, his being suspended from school for the third time, that led to his mom making a decision that he needed a fresh start to send him to go live with his dad. That set the stage for that. So for us, it was the Alliance was a real moment of kind of really beginning to understand state violence as government power that hurts young people, government power that harms young people. And also the way the school to prison pipeline is a very specific form of that state violence that young people of color face, LGBTQ youth face. And then for us, that generated this call to end the war on youth, right? End the state violence that young people are experiencing, create the conditions that resolve the kind of intercommunal violence that led to George Carter's death. And for us, that really began, the fight for that begins in our schools. And then I think the last part of the work is then 2016 kind of, again, we have the assault at Spring Valley, where the country and the world witnesses Shakara being choked and slammed out of her desk. And we see courageous teenager Nia Kinney organize what was a cop watch in school, and an attempt to try to stop the brutality that was happening to another student, be arrested and charged with the felony charge of disturbing education. And again, that just sent a ripple throughout the alliance. And as a youth organizer, or any kind of organizer, you know how hard it is to get people going. But when people are moving on their own, that shows you something. And so before we could even think about something, young people all over the alliance were writing love letters and sending them to North Carolina and Columbia to support Shakara, to support Nia, letting her know that she did the right thing. This is one of the moments that I really understood what young people and young people of color talk about when they talk about restorative justice, right, and healing harms. And then they brought it to the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing National Conference in 2015, and they pledged to build a national campaign and to defend Nia and Shakara and to build our rapid response around these assaults. And so since then, young people in the alliance and the organizations, we've documented over 69 different assaults of by school police officers. We've recently released a report we came to learn that documents not only the history of school to prison pipeline, but also young people's organizing against it, or to dismantle it, as well as a toolkit that offers us tools for communities to think about how to build their own rapid response capacity, how to organize campaigns that dismantle the arrangement between school districts, and really, for us, move us towards what we carry in our backpack, along with the tradition of Ella Baker, is the vision of that young man, George Carter, who imagined schools with mood detectors instead of metal detectors, schools that had strawberry gardens and in-school suspensions. And so that's our drive. That's our work in this current moment, to try to really redefine school safety with Black and brown youth centered. And for them, that doesn't equal more police, that doesn't equal more guns. And they were just on the Hill this last Tuesday for our third End the War on Youth Day, where they did a rally out front ahead of these recommendations from the Federal School Commission that we believe are going to only call for the hardening of schools, which we believe will only harden the school to prison pipeline, and calling on Congress to do all that they can to protect students and their rights, because we've seen this administration kind of spend the last year just stripping away rights for everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, for the labor of your network, really uplifting these really important frames and, putting yourself boldly, ahead of where we need to really be and bring the movement. And so really want to appreciate you and Zacchaeus for that. We have a couple of questions that came in. We'll start with some organizing questions and then move more broadly about what your work is going to look like in 2019. I think folks are really interested. And so in terms of the organizing work, we've gotten a question about how do you engage your networks and build relationships and partnerships with government at the local, state, and federal level. And so there's some interest in how you all organize around that. And so Jonathan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the levels of sophistication that we learned at youth organizers dealing with the federal government is how to be a real critical ally, right? And so while we were there kind of trying to help build stakeholders, trying to help shape policy and also process, and on some levels kind of being the face of these figures that they would have in these meetings, we are also very critical of many of the approaches of the department. We never let them go around that. I think one of the clear examples for us was that while we agree with a lot of the work in the direction around ending the school to prison pipeline, we were completely opposed to the administration's position on privatization. We're part of the founding networks for Journey for Justice and came together around the school closings in 2012, which had a huge impact on Black and brown youth across the alliance. And so for us, I think the relationship with government is one where I think if we are organizing, we have an independent base, we can enter into negotiations with governments from a position of strength. And then where it is helpful, also be a critical ally that can, again, offer solutions as well as offer corrections, challenge them and push them to do more. So that is that's kind of where we are. And also figuring out kind of who are some of the unlikely allies. I think some of the campaigns we feature have some very unlikely allies, like the work with the Labor Community Strategy Center around their work to end the 1033 program and get the LA School Police Department to return their guns. They had the LA School Police Chief was one of their allies. So it was just kind of, again, being really critical as allies as we're moving in, and also being able to challenge them when necessary.
Yeah, this is Zakia. I would agree with much of what Jonathan has said, definitely, especially around the unlikely allies, which I talked a little bit about in my introduction, which for Ohio, right, with the Republicans-led legislature and a governor, was able to push through some meaningful legislation around school discipline at a state level. That's definitely unlikely, and it was exhausting for the ally who happened to be our state senator. Very exhausting for her at the end, but she was able to get it done. The other piece I would say for us with regard to dignity in schools and racial justice, now for dignity in schools for several years, we partnered with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund to do federal advocacy work. And one of our main campaigns that we're continuing to do is around the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And so we've been supporting a number of our members across the country to really go deep with ESSA, because there is language in the actual law where state education agencies and local education agencies are required to engage parents in a meaningful way. The law actually says that. And so we've been equipping our folks, our members, with that language, working with the Opportunity Institute. We actually put together a toolkit ourselves called Engage for Education Equity, where it's about 50 pages, but it goes into detail about how parents can organize and how parents can advocate for what they need in their states and also at the local level. So at this point, since most of the state plans have been approved by the Department of Education, the focus is now shifted locally. So in Ohio, for Racial Justice Now, we have our parent organizer who sits on the Dayton Public Schools Policy Committee and on the Student Code of Conduct Committee. And so she's been able to engage around ESSA and making sure she's pushing for the priorities of the organization, which also includes culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy. The other piece is we know that organizers down in Mississippi and the Delta, Boston Student Advocacy Center, all of them also have meaningful campaigns around ESSA. So that's another piece that is still happening with regards to education advocacy and partnerships. So that's one thing, is like, the thing is, even when you get the policies passed, right, we see for our organizer, the implementation is the problem. And that's where the work is, really. Once you get over the hump around the policy change, you have to work with implementation. And so a lot of our folks are coming back to the table now, like trying to figure out strategies and other processes to make sure that the policies that everybody has been fighting for the last several years are actually implemented. And so that's the work for us at this point.
Zakia, we actually got a question related to your work, and so much of your story is about, being a parent who, saw for herself the experience of your child in a preschool setting, doing the legwork and research to really understand how that's connected to larger issues, systemic issues. And so the question was, how do you, have you engaged in your engagement with other parents? Do they see that, not see that? How do you navigate that? So do they see structural racism as a root cause issue?
That's an excellent question. Oh my God, I love that question. So intuitively, I think parents know that something's wrong. Now, do they use the language that, oh, this is structural racism? No, they're not using that language. But once we get into having the conversations and actually digging deeper into their stories and what actually happened and how things transpired, like they know something is wrong. And they may have an idea like, I think this might be racist. Like, why are they treating me like this? And why are they treating my kid like this, right? So yeah, parents, no matter what their education level is, I found have been able to interpret the situation and figure out that something is wrong. One of the things that we have been doing is actually helping to provide them with some of that language to be able to articulate when they're speaking to state legislators, right? When they're speaking to school board members, when they're speaking to the superintendent. That's something that we have been doing, and it's been very helpful with the folks that we partner with locally as well. And we also do our own study circles, right? We're advocating for closely relevant curriculum. One of the things that parents would ask, well, what is that? You know what I mean? And what does that mean? And how would that be, beneficial to our children and into the community at large? So it's definitely a work in progress. Study is very important, but for most of our parents who are, like I said, at the margins, poor and working class, they want the harm to stop like now. Right, because they're losing their jobs. Like they don't, we're not at the time, into all the curriculum stuff and language and having all that. They wanted the harm to stop. But now, since we kind of mitigated like some of that initial harm, like, and some of it has subsided a little bit, now we have been able to transition, as an organization to be able to dig a little deeper, and also included some healing practices. That's another thing. Organizers, especially those who are really at the margins economically, really have to do healing at the same time that they're doing the organizing, advocating, and policy work. That's something that we found that was critical, because it was becoming even more taxing to folks who are already taxed in other areas of their lives. So we had to bring in emotional emancipation healing circles through the partnership with the Association of Black Psychologists and the Community Healing Network. So all of that is continuing to happen, and the work is continuing to grow.
Amazing. I hope to do a webinar in the future around the healing justice. That's
yes,
important,
that's great.
Right? And labor that really needs to be acknowledged and supported. So I have a question for you, Mark, and it has to do, really with, given the emphasis on this book and those most impacted by educational injustice, hoping you can talk a little bit more about how you approach this work as a white man to lift up this work, and what did you have to consider and think about in approaching this work that you'd like to share with the field?
Sure. Thank you. It's a great question. Something I've thought about in my life for a very long time. I think that, at the core, I really believe that, all of us have a stake in educational justice and in fighting racism and systemic racism in our society. I think it's a cause that white people have to take up, and some white people have always and historically done that. And so I firmly believe that. I also believe that when we do that kind of work, we need to do it in strong, partnership with people of color, with, in my case, mostly organizers of color, and that, we have different kinds of roles to play. And it's not my role to try to dominate this effort with my position or my knowledge, but instead to work with people, to learn with people, and to also, use the skills and resources and capacities that I've developed for the cause of educational justice. And I think that I'm very involved with other activist scholars, actually cross-racially, but many of them are white, in trying to help people find that route forward. And doing that, I think it's important for us as white people to, know what our own story is. Why are we here? And, I have a story that I share in the book about growing up as a blue collar kid and the influence of my father, who was an unusual blue collar warehouse man who really believed, really was against racism, was a labor activist, and brought me up with those values, and then how that has shaped my life and how I've tried to pursue those values in my relationships with people. I don't think this book would have been possible if I hadn't been doing this kind of work for 20 years. I know when we were at Dyett High School with the hunger strikers talking about the book, G2 Brown said, he only participated because he knew the author, me, for a long time, and he trusted that what would come out would be something that really would support the movement, would not be something that was just about my career or, taking knowledge out of communities and putting it somewhere else. And so, I've always had, I have challenges and I've had to learn. And the challenge for me to do this book differently was a challenge for me to get out of my comfort zone and work in a different kind of way. So I think it's a journey, and that we have to grow and learn from that. But I really believe that, if we're going to really have an educational justice, racial justice movement in this country, it's got to be supported by everyone. People in the academy, professors, people in foundations, people in the legal and advocacy world, and also it has to be supported cross-racially by people of all races.
Thank you for that, and thank you for lifting up the importance of building trust. And also just want to lift up how, when I think of like the rock stars in our movement, and I'll call you all rock stars, I think about every single one of these individuals and groups that are in your book. And so, and they are rock stars because they build credibility in their work. They've been committed to this work. They have, been on the clock and around the clock, right? There's no time to really check out. It's not a 9-to-5 job. And so, it's really not a whole lot of glory in doing this work, right? But certainly this book is a start in terms of lifting up the amazing work and success of these groups. So, my final question is really around, there's, a call for this year to be over, right? And this book is probably one of the best things I think that happened in 2018 in the Ed Justice movement. And so I'm wondering if you could share what you're looking forward to in 2019 and what's next for your work. And so, Mark, I'll start with you, and then we'll do Zakiya and Jonathan and close out.
Sure. I guess there's a lot of different levels to that question. It's a great question. I am looking forward to, the People's Think Tank. So I'll just take that as an opportunity to mention that, this book is not the end. It is the beginning of building connections and relationships and sharing knowledge in the movement. In our book, we have 22, I think, contributors. There are a lot more organizers and education activists doing great work out there. And so we want to expand our network and have an opportunity to identify, who are some other organizers out there doing some great work, maybe some intersectional organizing, go and learn from them, maybe come out, help them write their stories, share them within our network so that we can really build a stronger and more intersectional education justice movement. So that's one of the things that I'm certainly looking forward to next year.
Yeah, same. I am also a member of the People's Think Tank with Jonathan and Mark, and so I'm looking forward to us building that out more thoroughly and building deeper relationships with the folks at that table and seeing what is birthed out of that situation. Also looking forward to just going deeper with our DSC members. A lot of our folks are, energized going into 2019. We also are supporting a lot of our members who are organizing around school safety issues as well that Jonathan mentioned earlier. We share some members as well. So our Counselors Not Cops campaign is definitely being ramped up more. DSC will also be re-releasing an updated version of our model code, model school discipline code on dignity. And so I'm looking forward to that being rolled out in the spring of 2019. And so we'll have some events around that, and yeah, definitely be lifting that up more and including some updates and other things, especially around gender justice and obviously our stronger position on the removal of regular presence of law enforcement in schools.
We look forward to ending the war on youth in 2019. But our work continues on. I think what we've seen at the end of this year is that young people are a fight back against these administrations and its policies, and they have been hit back again if we take what we've seen with the DeVos administration. So we're looking to grow the police-free schools movement. We're at 20 cities. We want to get to 40 cities, 40 campaigns by 2020 to see if we could again shift the political conditions, create more local opportunities to win. And some cities are in a race with each other. Cities like Oakland, Philadelphia, Phoenix have pledged to try to win police-free schools by 2020. So we're trying to get in with them with that and to see if there's other cities and other organizations that want to join us in this fight to protect young folk and to advance education justice.
Amazing. A lot of good stuff ahead. So I want to close us out. I'd like to thank Zakiya, Jonathan, Mark, all the people who are truly committed to this work, the organizations in this book. I want to thank you for your stories, contributions to the education justice movement. I'd like to thank funders who believe education justice is racial justice and that they are both linked to our democracy. And I'd like to thank you for supporting the organizing work that is needed for transformational change to happen. And if you are a funder who's interested in partnering with us or any of these groups to resource supports to these amazing organizations, please don't hesitate to reach out. And to stay connected with us, we invite you to join SHOT's Opportunity to Learn Network or on our website, and to follow us on Twitter for more learning opportunities. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And finally, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues here at SHOT. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.